Hey everybody, and welcome to part 9 of Science versus Atheism. We're going to get right in with creationist objection number 4. Quote, "Increasingly, scientists doubt the truth of evolution." Close quote. Some do, some don't. This is not really an objection as claimed by Mr. Rennie. It is simply a claim as to an observation. Even then, whether those involved in the true sciences do or don't believe in evolution is as irrelevant as it is with any or all segments of the population. It matters not as far as reality is concerned whether all or none or who believe or don't believe any particular claim. To assert otherwise is a pro-fallacy. That which we create within our own minds has absolutely no effect on the real world, perhaps on the way we perceive and interact with it, but no more than that. Any and all may believe what they wish. But if everyone on the earth believed that the world was flat, that would not change any external reality. As indicated at the outset, in the first place, science cannot evaluate as to truth. And in the second place, the vast major part of evolution is not even within the domain of science when the term is used with precision. Let the chips fall where they may. Thus, to imply the designation of true to any scientific theory, much less any philosophical conjecture, much less evolution, is not, nor can be, justified in the context of the precision that our language possesses. If one wishes to dumb down their discourse, so be it. But if so, stop making false pretense to possession of the power and authority that lies in correct and precise use of language. All such false pretenses are fallacies of transfer. To claim that evolution is science because someone defines it to be so is nonsense. One may as well define it to be a peanut butter sandwich. Definitions do not alter substance, and to misapply a definition is to commit the fallacy of transfer and diminishes and demeans the power and precision of discourse and communication. But maybe that is what's intended in the first place. Recall that most lies are woven on an interpretive network of facts by imposing incorrect and or non-existent connections. The article refers to a lack of creationist articles in the scientific journals. Rennie claims that most of the few that are submitted are rejected. Small wonder. And what little of the remaining that are published lack substance sufficient to attack evolution. Maybe and maybe not. One would suspect that such an evaluation is highly subjective. Maybe the editors involved have a prior agenda. As noted, the lack of such submissions is likely because the creationist position is highly and transparently ascientific. Few, if any, journals accept such articles, especially those journals dedicated to furthering the evolutionist position. Not because of their substance, but because of their approach and content. Notably, most evolutionist articles are also highly interpretive, but not so transparently. Because of their agenda and expertise and the need to so misconstrue, perhaps they are more experienced at the disguise. Also, as noted, most knowledgeable theists recognize that creationism is ascientific, so the noted lack of articles should really surprise no one. Mr. Rennie makes the false implication that since there are few, if any, substantive articles in said publications, the perspective must be inferior. On the contrary, there are numerous publications that discuss creationism versus evolution. Since theism is ascientific, such articles are of necessity in the ascientific publications, not in the scientific journals. But that does not mean that they are less perceptive or precise or correct. The standards of publication in scientific forums should exclude the ascientific. But that does not elevate the included material to superiority. Most editors that publish evolutionist articles either have an agenda or are not yet aware that most of the subject matter of evolution is also ascientific. And that's it for objection number 4. We're going to move right on to creationist objection number 5. Quote, "The disagreements among even the evolutionary biologists show how little solid science supports evolution." Close quote. In the first place, if this is really a creationist objection, it is irrelevant. Agreements or disagreements between individuals, regardless of their professions or degrees or whatever, have absolutely no effect on scientific support or evidence for or against anything. Any and all such existent possible viable support can only lie within the confines of the scientific method itself, and then only as pertains to effectiveness and not to the inaccessible truthfulness. If the arguments alluded to pertain to scientifically testable theories, then, interestingly, there is always room for variance in interpretation of the pertinent data, and the debate therein usually only refines the theories and applications. But if the arguments pertain to non-testable philosophical conjectures of evolution, then because of the lack of purchase in reality, sophistry and rhetoric and their associates are the only ones that will prevail. Mr. Rennie completely misses the substance of his own point of view and its problems. His response, quote, "Evolutionary biologists passionately debate diverse topics. List of such topics," close quote. "This is irrelevant." He then perpetrates a blatant prevarication. Quote, "Acceptance of evolution as a factual principle is nonetheless universal in biology," close quote. Perhaps those aspects of microevolution that can be subjected to the requirements of the scientific method, and even then confined to the effectiveness, not the truthfulness, of the concerned theories, but most certainly not as pertains to the non-testable philosophical portion that includes the whole of macroevolution. There may be practitioners that have subjectively and emotionally committed themselves to such a religious belief, but simply because they so believe does not elevate their subjective choices to the level of surety and truth. There is an ironclad guarantee to Mr. Rennie that a significant number of biologists do not accept macroevolution as truth. They understand and accept what has previously been presented herein, and they are still excellent biologists and do well in the practice of their discipline. It is not necessary to accept evolution in general to be a dedicated, knowledgeable, competent, excellent practicing biologist, and any attempt to exclude them from the brotherhood may result in the exclusion of the excluders, and a significant number of them are theists. The conjectures of macroevolution may be interesting reading, may provide comfort and satisfaction to those with such a need, and even lively to the imagination, but wisdom will leave it there, and intelligence will recognize it for that, and nothing more. The remainder of the response to this objection consists basically of a pro-fallacy by appeal to comments made by a believer in the theology of the Church of the Macroevolutionists, specifically an interpretive conjecture as to variation of rates of evolution during various periods of the past. As is always the case in such philosophical positions, there is no way to check directly any of the claims one way or the other. He also alludes to scientific authority, which is almost universally a self-serving and loaded requirement, since in precise context there is no such thing. There may be those who have thought themselves in deeper than others, and they may have some expertise inside that fantasy world, but to assert that their position therein elevates them to scientific authority, hence to expertise involving the real world, is absurd, especially when the content of their discourse is usually not even in science, but rather in philosophical conjecture, as is the case with all of macroevolution. I think I'm going to move straight into creationist objection number 6. Quote, "If humans descended from monkeys, why are there still monkeys?" Close quote. If this is really a creationist objection, then it is a rather poor one. The correct response by an evolutionist would be, because monkeys no longer changed but Homo sapiens did. Or, as indicated by Mr. Rennie, we had a common ancestor, and we changed more rapidly and or in different ways than they did. However, these and any other explanations are always ad hoc and after the fact. Ad hoc explanations are always unsatisfactory representations of science, especially in the case of non-testable, non-repeatable phenomena, because they are invariably concocted to fit the circumstances. It is not possible to justify any such explanation one way or another from the platform of science, or even philosophical conjecture, since it is untestable, thus can only be considered at most as interesting reading. If evolution happened as described, there is really no way to so certify. The whole of the philosophy of macroevolution is concocted after the fact, and thus cannot be justified as being the explanation to the exclusion of the boundless number of other logical possible explanations. It is not necessary to present a competing interpretation in order to understand the possibility of boundless other viable models of explanation. This is a consequence of the logic system within which the process of scientific inquiry functions, as reflected by our thought processes. If one wishes to argue on probabilities, there is no way to establish probabilistic values to any position. If one wishes to assign them equally, then each will necessarily have probability 0 before the fact, and all but one will be 0 after the fact, and that one will be probability 1. But we do not know from the platform of the reasoning methods of our mortal existence which one that might be. The evolutionist claims it is theirs, and the creationist claims it is theirs, and there is no way we can create within our system of reasoning to justify any claim to have accessed the correct answer. Sophistry and rhetoric notwithstanding, we have in and of ourselves no such fulcrum from which to leverage. Any relief from this position must come from a source that has the knowledge needed. The evolutionist negatively denies this source and is left to their own flawed devices. The creationist is required to directly contact this source if they wish to obtain the answer. Otherwise, both are on equal footing. His response, quote, "This surprisingly common argument reflects several levels of ignorance about evolution. The first mistake is that evolution does not teach that humans descended from monkeys. It states that they have a common ancestor." Close quote. Here he is requiring a precision of language that he himself violates. First, evolution is a philosophy, and philosophies do not teach, people teach, so it is the evolutionists, not evolution, that so teaches. Second, he is the one putting words in the mouths of the creationists, thus should be more honest. Third, it is unrealistic to expect the man on the street to be familiar with, much less use, the arcane insider lingo of the evolutionists. Anyone who looks at the conjectured images provided by evolutionists will generically call them monkeys. Fourth, creationists are not ignorant of the distinction made by the author. The author refers to a deeper error, then without precisely pointing to exactly what he thinks that error is, wanders off into a non sequitur with the question, quote, "If children descended from adults, why are there still adults?" Close quote. Where does this one come from? Children grow into adults, but Homo sapiens do not grow into monkeys. Also, children are born of, but do not descend from parents. In precise language, they descend from a line of their progenitors. The remainder of his response is essentially more McElligot's pool arguing. And that'll do it for this section. In part 10, we will be going over objection number 7 and 8 and 9 and possibly 10. They're getting much shorter from here on out. Thank you for listening.